Okay, well, let's quickly talk about those clobber passages. So there's 6 passages in the Bible that quote unquote condemn homosexuality. How do you know Christians often use them to condemn us? So how do you know they don't condemn homosexuality?
Yeah, I mean, I've literally spent almost the last decade in academic settings studying these verses, which is pretty insane. And the more I've studied, the more I'm looking at ancient resources, the more I'm understanding what was going on in the mind of Paul in the first century Greco-Roman world or in the Levitical author's mind, the more I'm convinced that it's literally impossible for these verses to be talking about anything like modern, consensual, loving same-sex relationships. It's not that those didn't exist in the ancient world. They did, but they were rare. And what did exist in both the ancient Canaanite and Egyptian cultures, which are the cultures being critiqued in the book of Leviticus, and what existed in the Greco-Roman world that the Apostle Paul is writing to in Romans and 1 Corinthians and the other New Testament passages, was this exploitative relationship between men of great power and privilege in the society who were permitted to engage sexually with anyone who was of a lower social status than they were. So there was no idea of sexual orientation in the ancient world. That didn't come about until the 18th century. People didn't think of themselves as gay or straight. You were allowed to have sex with whomever you wanted to have sex with, so long as they were underneath you socially, because sex was a display of power in most of these ancient societies. So just to narrow it down real quick, what's being condemned in Leviticus and in Romans and in 1 Corinthians is men who are sexually exploiting other men, both for pleasure and as a way of reinstating their dominance. And it's a clear condemnation of sexual abuse. We know that because, again, this was what was mostly happening in the Greco-Roman world. And this is only what was happening in ancient Egypt and Canaan. Both of those cultures were largely anti-loving, consensual, same-sex relationships. Like it was not a real thing in those societies. The only kind of same-sex relationships that were taking place were these exploitative ones. And so it makes sense that the author of Leviticus is condemning the thing that was actually happening. It makes sense that Paul is condemning the thing that was actually happening in his culture. And that doesn't completely free us from broader conversations about sexual ethics, but it just means that the clobber passages have nothing to do with the relationships that I'm seeking to be in, which are not based on power and domination, but on mutual love, consent, and respect.
This is probably a very big question, but I'm just like, why have so many people concluded that because of these passages, homosexuality must be a sin? Like, big question, but it's just mainstream Christian doctrine these days. Like, we're lost souls.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, what is fascinating is that, and I mean this with as much generosity as I can muster, I think most Christians are just ignorant of our history and our tradition. The idea that there has been one singular sexual ethic for 2,000 years that has always been promoted by a majority of Christians is just not true. Christian sexual ethics have changed dramatically over the last 2,000 years. From the Apostle Paul himself, who says, I would prefer that no one get married at all because Jesus is coming back, so don't worry about sex or relationships, to what we have today, which is most modern Christians say it's okay to have sex in the context of marriage, but just 500 years ago, they would have said sex was only meant for procreation. And if you were doing it for pleasure, that was a sin. These things are constantly morphing. The issue of homosexuality, again, didn't exist until about 150, 200 years ago at best. And so the kind of condemnations that we're seeing that are assumed to be basic Christian doctrine among modern Christians didn't exist until about 200 years ago. Now, there are other condemnations in the past of things called sodomy. Sodomy did not always refer to men having sex with men. There's a great book by Mark Jordan, a Harvard professor, called The Invention of Sodomy, which outlines the Christian history of this strange term. All of this is to say, like, it feels like the church has always condemned this and has been clear on this because we live in one moment of history where a majority of Christians do condemn homosexuality. But throughout Christian history, there have been variations of what sexual ethics were permitted, what relationships were permitted. And thankfully, we're also living in a day where, in America at least, a majority of mainline denominations are now fully affirming of same-sex relationships. So there is a shift back in a different direction.